Walter, Walter is an avid, experienced field botanist who focuses much of his botany explorations on Grey and Bruce counties, and from Newfoundland to Lake Superior and down into the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. His outdoor interests, which he has pursued since his teenage years, include tracking and wilderness survival, hiking, backpacking, canoeing, and just generally wandering the wild areas. He is the curator of the Ontario Wildflowers website, as well as the Ontario Trees, Ontario Ferns, and Ontario Grasses websites, which are the go-to sites for park staff, environmental consultants, and others who are in the business of identifying wildflowers and other plants in the field. In addition to these sites, he has created many other websites relating to survival, tracking, and the outdoors. In his work life, he is a busy self-employed accounting software consultant and a customer software developer and accountant. Walter and his wife, Julie, reside in Grey County on their 100-acre natural and farmland property. Walter, it's great to have you with us. Thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing more about Ontario's wildflowers.
Great. So I just share screen now, right?
Yes, share screen now, and I'm going to mute everybody else, so you'll have to unmute yourself, Walter.
Oh,
And
okay.
if you'd like to shut your screen off, some people can shut their screen off to cut down the load, but it's nice if the speaker can see a few participants anyway. So
Whoops, hang on. This is
I'm going to mute everybody. You'll have to unmute yourself, Walter.
there. Is that it?
You're on.
You're on.
All right. It worked. Technology works. Okay, so welcome everybody. Let's go back. There we go. This is I spent a lot of time wandering the wilds looking for wildflowers, among other things. In my wanderings, I've accumulated over 225,000 digital photos of them, and this evening I'm going to show you all of them. No, I'm just kidding. You won't have it won't put you to sleep that quickly. Just a note that I usually or almost always use common names for them. Usually the names that are found in Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, because that's what most people use to learn. As noted in the introduction, I'm not a professional botanist, just it's an intense hobby for me. I guess that's about all I need to say to start off with here. So let's just get into them. We're going to go on an exploration of wildflowers found in Ontario. Many different kinds, probably some you've never seen or heard of before. And I'll just talk about them as we go through. So there we go. So we'll start off with a bit of delay here. Start off with ginseng, which has been poached almost to extinction. It's one of the plants that if you find it in the wild, you don't tell anybody where you found it, except, you know, other responsible botanists or perhaps MNR, that kind of thing. Has rather inconspicuous and boring flowers, as you can see here. They sort of resemble wild leek flowers, except they're green. I've seen places where this is wild ginseng has been dug up completely. All you see is the pits left. But interestingly, they inevitably leave some fragments of the roots behind, and they start growing into new plants, which is interesting. And these are what the berries look like in September, mid-September, after a nice fall rain. Ginseng grows in woods, usually. Sometimes it grows surprisingly close to the Bruce Trail, and you wonder why it's still there. Although I've found poaching activity to be increasing in the past few years. And this is dwarf ginseng. I'm not sure if they're botanically related. Like I warned you, I'm not a scientist or botanist. But this is a lot smaller. It's only about maybe 3-4 inches tall. And I have found this as far north as Grey County, but it's very common down Lake Erie Way and down into the US. I have no idea if it has the same medicinal properties as regular ginseng. I've heard one person claim it does, but who knows? And hopefully soon we'll start to see bloodroot unfolding in the spring, but don't hold your breath, as we always get our hopes up in March for spring in Ontario, but unless you're in the south, it tends to take its time. But I love the unfurling of the leaves of bloodroot. So it's very beautiful. And that's the flower when it's full open. It's called bloodroot because the juices in the root really is blood red. And spice bush is another very early spring blooming plant. This picture is at the end of April. Tiny little yellow flowers along the stems. The stems are quite aromatic. Actually, the leaves even more so. That's an easy way to identify the plant. Just rub the leaves between your fingers and it's got a very distinctive odor. Beautiful little yellow flowers. Another spring wildflower is large flowered bellwort, a pretty common plant of the woods. Beautiful yellow flowers hanging down. Some people mistake this for perfoliate bellwort, which is actually quite rare in Ontario. And if you ever come upon this, because it's perfoliate because the stems pierce the leaves, which they do on large flowered bellwort as well. But in perfoliate bellwort, you have these tiny bumps all on the inside of the petals. And that's a for sure way to tell it apart. But chances are you won't find this much in Ontario. A lot of people mistake the other one for the perfoliate. And everybody's favorite in the spring, trout lily. Some people call this dogtooth violet. Dogtooth violet? Yeah, I think so. I never used that name, so I'm not sure. And don't forget, I've just come through a very, very busy winter of non-botany. So occasionally I might have to scratch my head over something as the botany terms and names come back into my brain. This trout lily is just starting to open and more. And notice the leaves, they have mottled color, said to be like a trout, and full open. They're really beautiful. You'll find, if you're getting into wildflowers, you'll find you can never get enough pictures of trout lily in the spring after the long drought of no wildflowers all winter. And there's a white trout lily, the different species. It's generally further south and it seems to like bottomlands, like floodplains along rivers, generally speaking. A lot of what I say about various species are generalizations because, you know, nature doesn't know our rules and hasn't read our books, and sometimes it shows up in funny places. But I really like the white trout lily. I consider it a real treat to find them. Generally, like I said, along floodplains on fairly larger rivers, like the Nith River has them, for example. Round-lobed hepatica. There's two species of hepatica, round-lobed and sharp-lobed. They're probably pretty well impossible to tell apart without the leaves. The leaves are pointed in the sharp-lobed and rounded in the round-lobed. And leaves are quite fuzzy when they're first open. Flowers are usually out before the leaves unfurl in spring. But another lovely spring wildflower. And of course, wild leeks, which we're all familiar with. Very common still in Ontario. Every green plant you see here is wild leeks. Unfortunately, in Quebec, they've been hunted, so to speak, almost to extinction, almost extirpated by people who gather them and eat them and sell them for other people to eat. And unfortunately, they're becoming more and more popular for that purpose in Ontario, especially due to the rise of social media, which people get on and promote the virtues of eating wild leeks, and then 3,500 people read that, and if even 10% of them go out and do it, that could be quite an impact. So it's gotten so that we have to be even more careful about locations of wild plants, and especially rarities. So whenever I lead an outing outside, to look at wild plants. If it's in an area that's at all sensitive or unknown, I pretty well, as politely as I can, lay down the law to not post anything on social media about it. Of course, I can't force anybody. It's still a free country, but you know, it's become a real problem. So just another quick view of wild leeks. And they are delicious, by the way. And some people claim just take the leaves and then you leave the plant to grow another year, but the leaves are what provide the energy to the plant. So anyways, pardon me. And these are the flowers of wild leek, which come out later in the season. This is mid-July, after the leaves are gone. The leaves are withered down into the ground, and the only thing you see is this upright stalk with these white flowers. These ones are sort of reaching the end of their life and starting to turn into seeds, as you can see here. So they turn into hard, round, black seeds, which are sometimes visible all through the winter. Another early spring wildflower is another shrub, leatherwood. Beautiful little yellow flowers. Leatherwood is a pretty cool plant. You can actually take a stem like this, and you can actually tie it into a knot without breaking the bark. And it's funny, it's called leatherwood, but it's actually the bark that is leathery. The wood inside is actually quite fragile, but it's supported by the bark and doesn't really fracture when you, I mean, I don't go around tying them into knots. I'm just explaining how leathery it is. If you're in a wilderness survival situation and you find leatherwood, you can consider yourself to be very fortunate, because it can be used for all kinds of things, like, you know, a substitute string, rope, and so on. But other than that, it's a beautiful wildflower. When it's out, when virtually nothing else is out yet. No leaves on the trees. By the way, this whole presentation doesn't go through the seasons. I just put lots of spring ones at the beginning because we're looking forward to that now. This is blue cohosh, and there's actually 2 different species of blue cohosh, which can sometimes be troubling to tell apart. This one is, I believe, giganteum. Very deep purple, reddish, purplish flowers, depending on how your eye sees color. And the flowers are full out when the leaves are still furrowed. And there's a close-up of it. Pretty beautiful. And this is the other species, Thalictroides. Generally speaking, the Thalictroides flowers are greener, and they come out more or less the same time as the leaves are out. And generally speaking, this one occurs more southerly, whereas the first one I showed you is more northerly. But it's okay to say, I don't know which one it is. It's just blue cohosh, and it's beautiful, and keep walking. And skunk cabbages are already starting to bloom. This is actually the flower of skunk cabbage. And yes, it really does actually melt the snow around it from the heat it generates by growing and blooming, which is pretty amazing. The flower buds are present the previous fall. And beside the flower bud here, down to the lower left, is a leaf bud. And they'll come out after, when the flowers are done. And I've heard that these plants can live for many, many years, like even like 100 years type of thing. They just keep growing and growing in the same spot and pushing their root farther down. I haven't verified that myself, of course, because I'm not that old. And yeah, here's a better picture of these are 3 flowers and 1, 2, 3 leaf buds. It is native. We hear the word invasive thrown around a lot these days. You could consider skunk cabbage invasive. In fact, I don't know if many of you know Larry Lamb. He was a professor at the University of Waterloo for many years in plants and botany. He calls this skunk garbage. He doesn't like it a lot because it does spread really readily, and it does invade every part of its habitat it can get its roots into. But it's a native plant, and that's the environment it lives in. Canada Mayflower, nice grove of that. A nice little small wildflower, only a few inches tall. Beautiful spring wildflower. This is the end of May. In case you're wondering how I know when these pictures are all are, I have a serial number for all my pictures, and that's actually displayed at the bottom. I leave that there so I know. And the first part of that serial number is the month and day of the picture. So no, I don't have a phenomenal memory. A really tiny spring wildflower is whitlow grass. There's several species of it. I don't even bother trying to tell them apart because you generally only see the one. And to show you how tiny this is, there it is with between two fingers. So I sometimes refer to these kind of flowers as just try to photograph me. Because when it's by itself, it's really tough to get close enough unless you have a pretty decent camera that likes to focus on things close up. And I just have pictures every now and then in this presentation of some of the places I've been. This is Algonquin Park. I don't go to Algonquin Park a lot because it's so crowded. I usually try and go there for a week in the winter to do tracking for a week, follow animal tracks cross country, wolves and fisher, marten, otters, mink, etc. It's a way of getting outdoors in the winter. And I just walk and follow tracks, snowshoe. This is an interesting flower. It's beaked hazel. It produces hazelnuts later. There's two species of hazelnut. This is beaked hazel. The other one is common or American hazel. And I can never remember whether this is the male flower or the female flower. It's one of those species that has males and females on, I believe, different plants. Yes, different plants. Again, very tiny, inconspicuous. You'd walk right past it unless you were looking for it. But pretty neat once you get up close and look at it. And beautiful early meadow rue. And I believe these are the female flowers. Very tough to photograph, not because they're tiny, but because the tiniest breath of wind starts these moving in the wind. And it gets all blurry on you. So it requires sometimes a lot of patience to photograph these, but beautiful early spring wildflowers. This is late April. And the leaves hang around all year. It's again, most of these plants have been showing you up to now are woods plants, forest plants. They come out when the leaves aren't out on the trees yet, so they get lots of spring sunshine. And of course, we all know white trilliums. This nice one has a dusting of pollen on its petals, maybe an insect visited recently, perhaps. We always appreciate the beauty of trilliums in the spring. And sometimes you're lucky enough to find a nice field of them, so to speak. Although, again, they're more patchy than they used to be. But isn't this beautiful? This is up on Manitoulin Island.
Mm-hmm.
It's really extraordinary to find this many of them. And as they age, they turn purple. And a lot of people who are getting into field botany think this is a different species of trillium. No, sorry, it's not. It's white trillium still. But they age into various shades of purple. And then eventually the petals, of course, wither up. And sometimes you come across a quadrillium, which is what some people call them, four-petaled trillium. That's pretty cool. I'm not sure, but this might be caused by a different number of genes or something like that. Not sure. Plants, like I said, they don't follow our rules. They just do whatever they feel like. And sometimes that gives rise to unusual things. The other thing with white trilliums is they sometimes develop these green stripes. That's actually caused by a virus in the plant. And apparently the plant lives for several years with this, and each year it gets more and more green, and eventually it distorts these stamens and other flower parts that they cannot reproduce. And eventually the virus does in the plant. And this is nodding trillium. I think there's something like 5 species of trillium in Ontario. I'd have to stop and count them on my fingers, but nodding trilliums are more common in northern Ontario, at least in my own experience. There's a nice grove of these along the floodplain of the Speed River north of Guelph. Nice place to find them. Notice I won't disclose locations very often, and even that's pretty vague, so good luck finding them. There's a few of these up on the Bruce as well. And now this is on our property here in Grey County. We have a bog. It's most of it, well, a portion of it's not officially on our property. It's Crown land, but I do a lot of exploring. In fact, when we bought the property about, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, we knew it had a wetland, but we didn't know it was a bog. And so I took a trip out there shortly after we took possession, and I was pretty excited to find out we owned a bog. Technically, it's a fen, but us commoners call it a bog. Got a lot of bog-like plants in it, so it was pretty awesome to find out we owned a bog. This is mountain fly honeysuckle, which, as I like to say, has nothing to do with mountains, flies, honey, or suckling. But common names are sometimes strange, every bit as strange as scientific names. This is a very early spring wildflower in the bog, one of the first to come out. It is a honeysuckle, and later it produces these berries, which, by the way, are delicious, very edible and delicious. But you got to act quick if you intend to eat some, because the birds and animals love them too. And this early July for the berries, and the flowers are mid-May or so, depending which bog you're in and so on. Some bogs are cooler than others. So that's pretty cool. There's a berry out there you can eat. Of course, not many people will ever see this plant because not many people go into bogs, thankfully, because bogs are very delicate ecosystems, and you can really see the effects of people being in them for a long time afterwards. Another beautiful spring wildflower, marsh marigolds, early May. I think something that most of us are familiar with. Pretty nice, though. One of the early ones, a wetland species. Close up of the flowers. They sort of look like buttercups.
Mhm.
And a fairly rare spring wildflower called twin leaf. There are places in the KW Field Naturalists have a reserve, which they purchased mainly to preserve a population of this, among other things. The flowers only last about a day and then they're gone. And if you happen to acquire any of this through legitimate means and you plant it in your garden, make sure it's shielded from the deer. The deer love to eat this plant. I don't know why. Well, I guess it tastes good to them. But I always get the name of this mixed up with twin flower, which is an entirely different plant.
Mhm.
But I know it's twin something. Which is it? So it's twin leaf because of the paired leaves. Wood anemone, a very small spring wildflower. This is a very close-up picture, so it's probably only 3 inches tall, 3-4 inches tall. They form carpets in the woods. Beautiful to see. This is not an identification session, or I'd show you leaves of this and that and talk about that. We have a lot of species to cover here. I want to show you as much as possible. So it's not my intent to help you identify these, just to show how beautiful wildflowers in Ontario can be. And some of the typical habitat I'll tromp through. Most of my exploring is off trail. I tend to be pretty adventurous, and have been all my life. So I'll plunge in. This is actually a swamp near, sort of in the vicinity of Cambridge, Hamilton. I'll plunge straight into something like this to see what I find. I've never been lost. This is a very rare plant, golden seal. It's again been poached almost to extinction because its roots are powerful, have powerful medicinal value. Very weird flower, no petals, just stamens. Very strange. I remember being on a field Botanist of Ontario outing once, and usually, I don't know if there's a correlation, usually you can trust people on a field Botanist of Ontario outing, and we were shown a nice patch of these, and I went back the next year to look at them again, and it was just bare flat earth where they had been. No sign of them whatsoever. Can't prove they were poached by anybody on that outing, maybe by somebody else, but and of course plants come and go from an area, but you just have to be so careful with rare plants nowadays. There's another picture of it with its leaves. So very special if you find any of these. It's definitely a hush-hush plant. Buttonbush. I guess named because of the globular flower clusters. Buttonbush actually, you've probably heard of shrubs being classed into alternate leaves and opposite leaves. Well, buttonbush actually has 3 leaves in a whorl. Not every time, but most of the time. It grows in wetlands, very wetlands. But pretty neat to find and see it. So a number of these plants I'm showing you, you have to get your feet wet to see them, or calves wet or legs wet. Large water plantain. Very cool flower. Here's a small water plantain. So large and small are just distinguished basically by the size of the flowers. And some botanical sources class them into one species and consider them to be varieties, but that's getting technical. So you see it's full on in the water, and therefore it's appropriately named. It's pretty cool to find though. You can see all the tiny flowers here up the flower stalk there. It's one of my favorite ones to find. Not uncommon. Marsh skullcap. I know of 2, I've seen 2 species of skullcap. This is marsh skullcap, which is a larger one. It does grow in wetlands. There's this one with much smaller flowers called, oddly enough, mad dog skullcap. But I guess it resembles a cap that people used to wear over their skull, I guess. I don't know. A lot of these English names are from a long time ago. And you got to name it something. So, what else would you call this? Speckled, large-lipped blue plant or something with a fuzzy head. You got to call it something. So, and it's better than calling it Bob's blue plant. So, yeah. Poison sumac, a very interesting shrub or small tree. This is its flowers. It's closely related to poison ivy, and yes, it does exactly the same thing to you that poison ivy does, although many sources will say it's much more virulent than poison ivy. But most people overlook it and certainly probably don't see the flowers. It grows in swamps and standing water. Again, another reason why most people don't see it. Flowers are kind of neat though, eh? And here are the leaves in the fall. So you see they resemble ash or sumac or something. Now this one is interesting. This is growing right beside the boardwalk in Southern Tract near Cambridge. And every fall around Thanksgiving, the leaves look like this. And we used to live close to this property, so I went there a lot. And sure enough, just before Thanksgiving weekend, this particular poison sumac was trimmed. And I'm pretty sure that somebody thought they saw some beautiful red leaves and took it home for their Thanksgiving bouquet every year. Either they were immune to its effects or they never quite figured out why they got such a terrible rash after Thanksgiving. And I thought that was, it's one of those things that's funny, but not funny, It's, I always found that, I have to admit, I always found that quite humorous. It pays to learn about nature and plants. but it is quite beautiful. Turns a beautiful shade of red. Tufted loosestrife, another wetland plant, pretty common, I guess, because the flowers grow in tufts. Notice the veiny leaves. There's other types of loosestrife, not related to purple loosestrife, by the way. It's a different set of names. So there's fringed loosestrife and other ones, but this is the most common. Well, I'd say fringed is very common as well. So equally common. Wetland, I said, yeah. Water avens. This is a very close up of it. Beautiful flower, again in the wetlands. You find a lot of neat stuff in wetlands. Maybe because they don't get impacted as much by people tromping around and poaching them and stuff. So more stuff is there, perhaps. I don't know. Or maybe you just need to learn to look for it. If you're learning botany, I mentioned at the beginning, field botany, the best field guide above all is Newcomb's Wildflower Guide. And another odd name, square-stemmed monkey flower. It's supposed to resemble a monkey somehow. I'm not good at seeing images in things like clouds or plant shapes or something. Never have been. I tend to just see the plant and the clouds for what they are. But I guess this resembles a monkey somehow. And this tends to grow in dampish areas. Not overly common, but pretty cool when you do come across one. It really does have a square stem. Some things are called square when they're not really. Pretty diverse, the forms of flowers and so on. Turtle head, another one named after an animal, insect, or whatever. Again, said to resemble a turtle head. I guess it kind of does. Wetland plant again. I guess I'm realizing how many wetland plants I have in here in this presentation. I never thought about that before. These come out later in the year, late summer, late August. Pretty neat to see them. And this is them in winter, after the flowers are done and the seed pods have opened and dispersed the seeds. Now that could look like a turtle with its mouth open. And you can see it's right by the creek there in the winter. So yeah, you can do field botany in the winter too. And I have a number of pictures in here with plants in their winter stage, their winter form, so to speak. So, you know, it's actually more challenging to go around and ID stuff in the winter, but after you've been at it for a while, it's not that hard. And it's pretty rewarding because you can get a bit of a botany fix even in the middle of the winter. And just a sec, I get a drink of water. This is the single most poisonous plant in all of North America. It's water hemlock, quite common in Ontario. One mouthful of this plant will kill you. Not might kill you, not maybe, but will kill you. This is what its leaves look like. It does grow in wet areas and water. These are its flowers, full out in the mid-July. A lot of the books, when you see this plant in the book, they'll caution you against confusing it with wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace. And
That's the same.
because of the white flowers and the way they're, you know, arranged, flat-topped panicle. And I always laughed at that because I said, how on earth could you confuse those? Because wild carrot grows in dry fields and water hemlock grows in the water. Until one day I was walking around a friend's property with them, and guess what? Side by side, there they were, water hemlock and wild carrot right beside each other. It was unbelievable. I guess the soil was just damp enough or just dry enough for them both to exist there. And notice the leaf pattern is rather haphazard. Sometimes there's some leaves sticking out here, sometimes not. You know, sort of messy leaf pattern. That's how you ID this one. I wouldn't even touch this in the field because I wouldn't want to inadvertently even lick my fingers afterwards. Their kids have been seriously poisoned by using the hollow stems as pea shooters. So it's very poisonous. So don't put this in a salad. And this close relative called bulblet bearing water hemlock. So the leaves are very skinny. but same poisonous. Flowers look the same. It's just the leaves are very different. Same habitat. See, there's the regular ones and the bulblet bearing. They call it bulblet bearing because there's tiny little bulblets along the leaves. I don't think we see any here, but anyways. And then I want to show you this one, which is called water parsnip. Now notice the leaves are very similar, the flowers very similar, but this plant is actually edible. But because of the similarity to water hemlock, people often mistake water hemlock for this and have poisoned themselves with it. So I've done a lot of, I led a wilderness survival nature tracking club for a number of years, and we used to go out and find what we could to eat in the wild and so on. We didn't necessarily harvest things, we just sort of identified things. This one sort of falls into the classification. It's edible, but don't bother because of the danger of confusing it with the seriously poisonous water hemlock. Oh yes, and water hemlock is related to poison hemlock, which is not native to here, which I believe it was Socrates used in Europe to commit suicide. I heard it's not a pleasant way to die. You do not drift off quietly to sleep. Oh, and that's the flowers of water parsnip. Yeah, it's very similar to the water hemlock. Sometimes I forget which what I have next. Very beautiful flowers, the stamens sticking out there, trying to entice insects in. Violets. Violets are notoriously difficult to tell apart. I've managed to master a lot of them, but there's still a few that confuse me. This is marsh blue violet. No, it's not common blue violet. It likes to grow in marshes. Violets, you often use the color of the petals, whether the flowers are above the leaves or at the same level, the habitat, and the type of hairs inside the violet's throat, which we'll get to in a second. So marsh blue violet. Now marsh blue violet has distinctive hairs, and this falls under the photograph that category. See my finger? So these marsh blue violet has club-tipped hairs inside the throat of the flower. That's how you can tell it. It's very reliable characteristic. Of course, you know, just like all plants, the darn things hybridize with other species. So sometimes, like I said before, sometimes you just have to put the plant down and walk away and say, I don't know what that is. I don't care. I'm going on to the next plant that won't drive me crazy. So that's pretty cool, but it's pretty small. You gotta have good eyes or a good camera to see this. Quite frankly, I was amazed I managed to get these pictures. And of course, yellow violet, which in botany, there's a lot of upheaval occurring right now due to DNA studies of plants, and they've been reclassifying them like crazy. There's always been some splitting and lumping of species. So splitting is when a plant gets split into two separate species, gets to be considered two separate species. And lumping is when they combine two plants they considered separate in the past into one species. And yellow violet is one of those. So it used to be smooth yellow violet and downy yellow violet. And now it's just yellow violet. Well, of course, it depends what authority you listen to as well. But yellow violets are pretty distinctive to find. There's not many species of yellow violets around. There might only be one. I have to really think about it. As I said, it just came through a winter of non-botany, intense IT brain work. Another really cool plant is golden saxifrage. These are the flowers. I've only ever seen this plant once or twice. In each case, it was growing in mud. And so you can imagine it's very easily disturbed and destroyed by somebody or something stepping on it in the mud. But it's pretty cool. And you won't get very close to it without getting very muddy. But fortunately here I was on a wooden bridge and I could get down and photograph it. I believe this is in the Dundas Valley. Pretty interesting flower though. Very close up here. Dodder. There's several species of dodder. This is the most common one. Dodder is parasitic upon other plants, so it doesn't grow on the ground. it wraps itself on other plants and has these little suckers that go into the plant and suck, well, not so much suck, but obtain nutrients from the plant, from the host plant. I believe this is swamp dodder. It's growing on a sensitive fern, which is a wetland fern, and it's in bloom. It's a pretty cool plant, the fact that it can grow like that. And these are the close-up of those flowers. Again, see the size of them compared to my finger. There's a lot of tiny stuff out there that you miss if you just walk, just keep walking on by. You got to slow down and look down to see a lot of these things. As probably, I would hazard a guess that many or most of you are birders where you're used to looking up all the time, while botanists are looking down all the time. Field botanists, Beautiful late summer, early fall wildflower, Grass of Parnassus. There's 3 or 4 species of this in Ontario. One of the other species was growing up on the Bruce at Dorcas Bay, but the 2 factors, one, the intense influx of people up into the Bruce, and number 2, the high lake levels have contrived to probably eradicate this from the 2 spots. I know where it was. The other one was a lot smaller and blooms a lot earlier. So there's a good example of just people having an intense negative impact on loving nature to death, so to speak. So I'm still going to look there if I can get there at that time when it used to bloom there and see if it's still there. But this one, this so-called regular Grass of Parnassus, is very common in wetlands and bogs and fens everywhere. There's thousands upon thousands of them in our fen bog here. Beautiful late summer wildflower, September sometime. And yet another wetland, marsh cinquefoil. I include this because of the amazing color, the yellow fringe along whatever you call that color, burgundy, or it's almost black. It's pretty amazing flowers. Love finding this. Marsh cinquefoil. Cinquefoils are a whole group of plants. Most of them have 5 leaflets, hence the name cinquefoil. Some have 3. Flowers are, or have been, generally classed by flower structure. So those with similar or identical flower structure are considered to be in the same genus or group of plants. So cinquefoils have similar flower structures. Starflower, very common early summer, late spring flower of the woods. Easy to recognize, easy to find. 1 or 2 flowers. This nice simple whorl of leaves. The leaves last all summer, but the flowers don't last very long, like typical spring, early summer wildflowers. Most of you have probably seen this somewhere, whether you knew it or not. And a very similar looking plant, but very different flower is Indian cucumber root. Blooms roughly the same time, maybe a bit later. A lot of wildflowers, certain wildflowers are very difficult to photograph, get a nice clean photograph because tiny spiders like to take up residence. So you can see the spider webs here. And I don't like to clean them off. That's the spider's home, and why be so fussy? This is what the flower really looks like. So I just leave it alone and photograph it the way it is, because this is the flower. A very unusual, spectacular flower though. And it's Indian cucumber root. Yes, the roots really are edible. Please don't. This is not overly common. And you don't get much. You rip up the plant and you get a tiny, tiny little piece of root that will probably sustain you for like, I don't know, 10 minutes in the larger scheme of things. It's just not worth, unless you're in a survival situation. Indian pipes, or some people call them ghost pipes. These are one of the few plant species that has no chlorophyll in it. So they subsist entirely off fungi in the soil. And they put up these stalks with flowers on them so that they can reproduce and produce seed. Beautiful, beautiful plants. Indian pipes have one flower on each stalk. Fairly common, and you'll see them even through the winter. Once the flowers, as they open and get fertilized, they gradually become upright, and then they form seeds and they fade to black, so to speak. They gradually dry out and shrivel to a black, hard stalk, which can persist through the winter. This is a nice little group of them coming up in the moss. And this is pine sap, very similar, but you see there's many flowers on one stalk. And it's, of course, cream colored instead of white. But otherwise, the same idea, no chlorophyll, etc. Both of these are relatively common, and you'll often find pine sap growing in colonies. Perhaps it likes the certain kind of roots or something, and they'll grow off that or something. Pretty cool. Butterworts, very tiny, I won't say a bog plant, but tends to grow it can grow in fens or where there's seepages. Butterwort because of the color of the leaves, and the leaves are actually very slimy, and they do catch tiny insects. So they are a carnivorous plant. They catch the tiny insects and digest them on the leaf surface by breaking, I guess the chemical that's on the leaves breaks down the insect into nutrients the plant can use. Spectacular, tiny little flowers. This is, they are tiny in spite of the size in the photograph here. Sometimes very hard to get at to photograph because they are way over there in a wetland or something like that, or in a wet area, and tromping over there would just totally rack up the land between you, where you are, and where these are. But I do know sites where these are easily accessible. Oh, and a close-up of that. Very close up. Looks like about June sometime. This is probably up on the Bruce. Notice a lot of plant stems are kind of hairy. Hairs tend to allow the plant to keep more warmth next to it. Who knows if that's the actual reason why this evolved hairs, but that's a result of hairs anyway. And there's more hairs, wild ginger. These flowers are close to the ground, inconspicuous, covered with hairs. I won't say because, but maybe because they come out very early spring, so they need to keep some warmth to themselves. I say maybe because we don't really know for sure why the plant evolved that way. It might be for an entirely different reason than it just kept the hairs. We don't know, but we can speculate. These ones are, I think they're fertilized by ants, and apparently the ants like the seeds and carry them off and help to spread. Wild ginger is not related to ginger you buy in the store, but interestingly, it smells pretty well exactly the same and can be used in the same way. Very common wildflower, very interesting flowers. Very hard to photograph because they're so low to the ground. Well, you can photograph it this way, but hard to look up into the flower and photograph it without your big fat fingers being in the way. And this is a nice grove of wild ginger. This has a story behind it. There's a site up in Grey Bruce called Bayview Escarpment. And I'd always been to this place in late summer or fall, never in the spring. So finally, after so many years of visiting, I went there in the spring. And guess what? That day, these snow squalls rolled in off Lake Huron and covered everything in snow. So it's pretty, what?
It's pretty.
Finally get here and this happens. It was beautiful anyways. It's just pretty ironic.
Yeah.
It's beautiful, but it shows you these plants are adapted to this. They can handle it, or they wouldn't be out at this time of year, because this does happen. When was this? Mid-May. So what, 2 months from now? So we haven't seen the last of winter yet for a while, mostly, but it can happen even into May. Very beautiful though, I have to say. I wasn't really dressed for it. I got kind of cold, but I didn't want to leave because it was so beautiful. This is a snowberry, a shrub, snowberry shrub. There's a creeping snowberry as well. So it's called snowberry because the fruit of this turn into are literally, pure white berries, round berries. Spectacular, but it's got an interesting flower, all fuzzy inside. Snowberry shrub is very common all over Grey Bruce, down in south into Hamilton, Burlington, and so on. Not rare at all. Very small, usually very small spindly shrub. An interesting creeping snowberry, tiny subshrub, is actually a woody plant as well. Wood betony. Further south you go, the more common this is, but this is, there's places up in Grey Bruce where this is quite common as well. They're locally common. This plant comes in many shades, sort of greenish yellowish here, and grades down into, you find them purple colored as well. It's pretty interesting flowers. Spring, again, a spring wildflower, mid-May or so in the woods. Not uncommon, but very cool to see, nevertheless. Just another beautiful area that I go hiking through off trail. This is near Orangeville. Yellow pimpernel. Not a very common woodland yellow flowered plant. Very interesting. I always love coming across this one. Sort of like an explosion of flowers. Carpenter's Square. This is the flower. We'll just jump ahead to the next one. That's looking into the flower. Apparently these are pollinated by hornets. I don't know why. Why hornets? And why do hornets like these? But they do. Carpenter's Square, more of a southerly plant, Hamilton, Burlington, sort of like that area. This one was probably in the Royal Botanical Gardens in Hamilton, Burlington. Very unusual. Not readily recognizable. You sort of have to, just get to know plants. One way to really learn plants is to start out at the beginning of a trail, and as best as you can, resolve to identify every single plant you come across as you walk, except of course grasses and sedges and rushes, which are in a class of their own, very difficult for somebody who's learning. But you learn a lot, and it probably take about an hour to walk the first 100 yards. But it's a very good way. Discipline yourself and just say, I'm going to stop and I must identify every single plant if I can. Having a camera of some sort aids greatly because you can take a picture, and when you get home you can look it up in all your other books or other sources. Of course, Murphy's Law of Plant ID kicks in, and that is the one characteristic you did not photograph turns out to be the key one that you must have to identify that plant. It always works out that way. But at least you tried. Michigan lily. People often misidentify this when they're using the wildflower books, and they call it Turk's cap lily. It's not. That's not here. This is Michigan lily. This again is in Southern Tract. Well, I don't know if they're still there. They were many years ago. Beautiful woodland lily. There's also a wood lily, which you'll find up in Grey Bruce a lot. Pretty amazing flowers. It likes dampish soils, this one. Purple flowering raspberry, spectacular bluish type of flower. The berries are edible, but not quite as nice as the regular raspberries or blackberries. This doesn't go much farther north than partway up the Bruce, and then farther north there's a different one called thimbleberry. I always love coming across this one. Prairie dock, which is a very rare tall prairie plant. You're unlikely to find this in the wild unless you're down in the Windsor area. Here's a bunch of them. This is on a Field Botanists of Ontario outing. So you see they get very tall. If you can acquire legitimate plants from somewhere, by that I mean that the grower has grown them from seed and not poached them from the wild. This does well in gardens. And so it's quite a novelty to have in your natural habitat garden. So again, they're in sunflower family. Sunflower family has these large petals around and then a whole bunch of disc flowers in the middle. So it's a very cool, very rare plant because its habitat has been destroyed. It's been turned into farmland. Viper's bug loss, speaking of weird names, this is one of the weirder ones. I don't know who Viper was and why did he lose his bugs, although that's probably not what it refers to. Sometimes people call this blueweed. With plants, occasionally I'll come across a white form. We're going to see that further on with another very interesting plant, but I found these pure white, and it's not a separate species or anything. It's just a different form. Viper's bug loss is not native, very common along roadsides. So, and some people, of course, like to label it invasive, but really all it's doing is growing where not much else will grow, because not a heck of a lot can grow along the roadsides. Viper's bug loss, wild carrot, other things like that, mostly non-native, but they can fill in the gaps where there aren't natives to grow there. Maybe there used to be, but right now, this is what's growing there and fills the spaces. Yellow sweet clover, again, as far as I know, it's not native. There's a white sweet clover as well. This one's not as prevalent, and the white sweet can act pretty invasive, but beautiful color, beautiful flowers. I'm going to move through just a little bit more here. American Columbo, a spectacular, huge flower. We'll get to that in a second. It grows like a rosette for years. And then one year, it's like as if it wakes up and shoots up a stem 4 to 6 feet tall with these amazing flowers on the end. And then it dies. Just like that. But pretty amazing flowers. There's some of this in Burlington. Moth mullein. You all know common mullein. Well, this is moth mullein. It's related, but very different flowers. Sometimes yellow, sometimes white. I think I have to speed up a little bit because of the time. So forgive me if I pass by something that's very interesting to you. Herb Robert. It's in the geranium family. Very common in the woods. Nice blue thing in the woods to see, to come across. Again, this is Herb Robert, the side view. The leaves have a distinctive smell, at least they do to me. Cooper's milk vetch, not overly common, but again, you'll find it up on the Bruce. And those are the seed pods for that plant. Pretty interesting. All inflated looking. We all know Jack in the Pulpit. This is unfurling in the spring. And this is it when you're hiking the Bayview Escarpment in the spring and the snow squalls come in.
Wow.
Wintergreen. We're very familiar with wintergreen flavoring. The leaves do taste exactly like wintergreen, and the berries are very edible, but the birds love them too. And so it's a food for birds in the late fall and winter. But they are very tasty. Both leaves and berries are edible by us. There is a joke to say that every plant is edible once. Well, this is edible. This is edible more than once, so it's okay. Another just beautiful dune habitat on Lake Superior. Unfortunately, this has been seriously impacted by ATVs. Fringe Polygula. This looks like an orchid, but it's not. Some people call it gay wings. The leaves, although not in this picture, the leaves can resemble wintergreen. The beautiful spring wildflower, and it can, well, there's a close-up of the end of it, very close up, and it comes in a white form as well. And some botanists will really lust after finding this white form of it. Like, where is it? Where is it? I want to see it. I've only ever seen it once in the white form. Mitrewort, spring wildflower, very tiny flowers, and closely related is naked mitrewort. Naked seeds, thinner and much more delicate. grows in the woods, whereas mitrewort is more of a dampland species. But this is very cool to come across. You need good eyes to spot it. It's not very tall, very, very delicate, amazing little plant. Pale jewelweed, we're all familiar with jewelweed or touch-me-not, I'm sure. And this is the seed pods, which explode. They're spring-loaded, and they end up like that, and they throw the seeds a great distance. And this is why it's called jewelweed, because of the rain droplets on it. And there's an orange variety called spotted touch-me-not. I just usually refer them to yellow and orange jewelweed or touch-me-not. Pretty common. It's also the juice from it tends to relieve mosquito bites, the juice of the stems. Pawpaw, a tree with a flower. So here we have flowering trees. Of course, all plants flower, vascular plants, well, except ferns, but we're not going to get into particulars and get splitting hairs here. But trees and plants, as we sort of talk about them, all of them flower, and this is a pawpaw flower. Pawpaw is a tree, very southerly species, Carolinian, quite rare nowadays, generally speaking. The fruits are edible more than once. Sassafras, another tree. This is the flowers of sassafras. And not a tree, rose twisted stalk, just a neat woodland wildflower. Wild geranium, I'm going to jump past this, pretty common. Silverweed, I guess I've been talking too much, used up too much time here. Silverweed, nice yellow flowers, tends to grow in sandy, dry soil, sometimes sort of dampish, sandy, sometimes dry soil. Probably has to be water underneath. Very common up around the northern Great Lakes, Lake Huron, for example. Heartleaf tear thumb or tear thumb. It's called tear thumb for a reason. These downward pointing are not soft hairs. These are thorns, and they will rip your skin apart. So yes, it will tear your thumb. This is Burlington area. A very rare thistle called pitcher's thistle. It's been getting planted in areas around Georgian Bay, Lake Huron, Manitoulin. So it's starting to come back ever so slowly, but it was almost extirpated in this area. Very different color from usual thistles, like sand dunes. So it's very prone to being disturbed. Hills thistle, which is another rarity to the upper Great Lakes, like Georgian Bay, Lake Huron. It's becoming almost common in some local areas I've found compared to say 10, 15 years ago. So it's increasing. And that's the flower for Hills thistle. Hoary puccoon, another grows on dunes. There's a hoary puccoon and a hairy puccoon, and I'm not going to get into the difference because I don't remember. But it's hoary is the one we usually see. Sand dunes. Cardinal flower, nice marshland late summer plant. Occasionally it comes in white, and which time I call it a pope flower. Climby ground cherry, very weird flower. The foliage on this feels clammy, feels sticky, but it's not really sticky, but it feels sticky, very weird. Carrion flower. So insects that like carrion are attracted to this because that's what the flowers smell like. And these are the berries from that. And there's several species, very difficult to tell apart. Kentucky coffee tree, I'm just going to jump past here. One-seeded burr cucumber, which is related, I believe, to the wild cucumber, but the flowers are different. I've only ever seen this once down in Flamborough area. Sudden Tract, a beautiful place to go for wildflowers, by the way, near Cambridge. Roundleaf sundew. And the flower of roundleaf sundew, which are very tiny and also very difficult to photograph. Apparently they come out only in the sun, and only the top one of the curled stalk blooms at one time. cranberry, large cranberry and small cranberry, very tiny. And large cranberry is the commercial cranberry that we can buy and eat, and small cranberry. Pitcher plant, these, by the way, are the petals, which we don't often see. They fall out fairly quickly. And these are the familiar pitchers, which are modified leaves. And the flower, looking inside the flower, took a petal off so you could see inside. And the downward pointing stiff hairs so bugs will slide down these into the water reservoir, find it very difficult to get back out because of these downward pointing stiff hairs. And believe it or not, there's actually insects that live inside the pitcher in the water and somehow avoid getting digested by the pitcher plant. And they actually prey on the insects that fall in. Jesus, competition everywhere. Gold thread, a beautiful swamp, deep swamp type plant. Very sort of early spring, spectacular flower. The roots really are gold colored, gold yellow. Buckbean, wetland plant. I should call this Ontario wetland plants almost, eh? Didn't realize. Labrador tea. And yes, you can make tea from the leaves. And yes, it's quite interesting and nice to drink. These are the flowers. And if you do a lot of rambling looking for wildflowers, sooner or later you will come across this marijuana. Somebody growing it out in a remote area somewhere, especially back when it was illegal. Perhaps not as much anymore, but you will come across that sooner or later. Moneywort, just going to jump past there. Sharp-leaf cancerwort, not native, but a heck of an interesting little flower in the snapdragon family. Stinking chamomile. I like to put this in because if you crush the foliage, it actually smells like urine. Very interesting. I always wonder who on earth you would give a bouquet of these to. Maybe it's the bouquet you give to somebody you're trying to split up with. I don't know.
Yeah.
Motherwort, fascinating flowers on a non-native plant. Most people consider this to be a weed, kind of prickly plant, but most people never stop and get down close and look at the flowers. Fascinating flowers, just wild. Look like little monsters or something. I don't know, but this look like flowers actually, but you can use some imagination. Wild carrot. This is the wild carrot, which we were talking about earlier, with a spider that got a bee or a fly lurking in wait. Blue-eyed grass. I don't know why they call us blue-eyed grass because it's yellow in the middle, but blue-eyed it is. There's several species. It looks just like grass with a blue flower. Indian grass in bloom, native grass. So grasses have flowers. Burning bush, let's skip that. Catalpa, a tree with spectacular flowers. Catalpas are very common more in the south. And tulip tree flower. Again, tulip trees grow more in the south. Of course, I'm speaking from a Grey Bruce perspective here. More in the south would be where you guys are in Stratford.
Carolinian.
Carolinian, yes. And just a very remote part of the Bruce. This is about 3 or 4 hours from the nearest road. Pineapple weed, let's just jump past that. Periwinkle, I got to talk about this. Seriously invasive, and this is where the word invasive really does apply. Pretty little flower, but if periwinkle gets away, it does this. Notice there's nothing else growing amongst the periwinkle. No woodland wildflowers, no other ground small plants at all. Just totally carpets and takes over. So this could be some guy, some person dumping their yard waste out the side of the road, and a whole bunch of years later, it's done this. So very bad, seriously invasive. So please don't do that. Don't buy it, don't plant it, dig it up if you have it, get rid of it, please. This is in here only because of its name, bastard toadflax. I love some of these plant names. You wonder where on earth they came from. Almost sound like you're swearing when you say it. Very common though up in the Bruce. Lockseed. The flowers, as they age, they gradually turn downward until at the bottom here, they're totally facing down for where the seeds form. Woodland plant. Orange fruited horse gentian. The flower is fascinating, but again, the name is weird. Prairie smoke, a beautiful seed formation. Wow. It's a prairie grassland plant. Member of the Avens family. Teasel, not native, but fascinating nevertheless. I'm sure we're all familiar with it, all prickly. Yellow stargrass, again, only in the very south in Ontario, common farther south of Ontario. Butterfly milkweed and poke milkweed. Poke milkweed lights the woods. This one's in Sudden Tract. I took this in, 2004, and this plant is still there. I was back there this past summer. And swamp milkweed, notice the flowers are so dark. I've seen them almost black. Crazy color. Swamp milkweed fibers, by the way, when they're dried up, make excellent cordage. Weave it into a string that's so strong, it could probably cut your skin. Smaller fringed gentian, up on the Bruce. Mistletoe. So these things growing on the black spruce are mistletoe. I don't think it's big enough to kiss anybody under though. This is the disreputable, nasty giant hogweed. And this is it with flowers and flowers turning into seeds. Get quite tall, but I'm sure you've all heard lots about it, but I like to keep this in my presentation just to remind people that it's there. Not very common, you know. Yeah, I've really had to look around to find it, but you don't want it to get common. It's nasty. No, we're getting there. We're getting there. Goldenrods. This is bog goldenrod. This is on our bog and our property. Goldenrods and asters have a reputation for being very hard to identify apart, but once you know the rules, they're actually quite easy. This is, which we're not going to get into them today, of course. This is grass-leaved goldenrod, purple-stemmed goldenrod. I love this photo because it looks like the ant is learning how to identify goldenrods. And more blue-stemmed. This is upland white aster, very common up Grey Bruce. It's actually a goldenrod. That's not the result of recent DNA work. They've known it's been a goldenrod for some time. It just looks like an aster, sort of. Very common. I put this in common ragweed because common ragweed is what causes hay fever, not goldenrod. Not goldenrod. Somebody wants to know more in the questions at the end, I can explain, but I'm trying to get through all these. I went a bit slower than I intended. This is gray goldenrod. Again, there's distinctive features, easy to tell it apart from other goldenrod species. In this case, got a grayish stem and it curves over like that, and it grows in dryish, gravelly, usually gravelly type areas. Putin's goldenrod, extremely rare, only known to a few sites in the world, and they're all on Bruce Peninsula, Manitoulin Island, and possibly Michigan. And that's it. This is a wildflower in the winter. This is a rough-leaved goldenrod. And you can tell by the configuration of the stems and habitat. It's in a marshy area and the type of leaves. So you got to be at it, I guess, for a while to get to know that. But that's an example of ID in the winter. And butterflies like goldenrod, as do an incredible array of other insects. Love goldenrod. This is stiff goldenrod, a southerly goldenrod species. This is a white goldenrod called silver rod. Asters, purple stemmed aster, very common. And this is also purple stemmed aster, but recently it's been split out into another species called shining aster. And they're actually not hard to tell apart once you know the characteristics. New England aster, which we're all familiar with. A close-up of New England aster flowers. Amazingly beautiful. Love New England asters. Heath aster, one of the last asters to bloom, and therefore one of the last wildflowers to bloom. Amethyst aster, which is actually a hybrid between New England aster and heath aster. And this photo shows all three species. But again, we're not learning asters right now, so I'll skip that. This is a Pelee National Park. Tall sunflower, and the reason I included this is because, yes, it is tall. Of course, that flower picture was not from this plant, but isn't that astounding? This is a Windsor area. It's unbelievable how tall it is. Green dragon, which is related to Jack in the Pulpit, as you can sort of see there, sort of. Oops, sorry, and the leaves. Witch hazel. Okay, so this would be one of the last flowers to bloom at all in the season. They can bloom even into December and January. And another picture of them. Okay, we're on the last section, orchids. Orchids are at the end here. So almost done here. Thank you for your patience. This is called Hooker's orchid. It's gotten very rare. I only know it from one site in the Bruce. And interestingly, it's not called Hooker's because of the hook, but it's named after a botanist called Hooker. Interesting, though, the coincidence, though. And that's a close-up of the flowers. I love orchids, by the way. And these are the leaves, which somehow always manage to stay on top of the leaf litter. And there's one site where I know these. I check it almost every year. There's less every year. This is Arethusa, or dragon's mouth, bog orchid. I know one bog on private property where there are thousands and thousands of these, but outside of that area, almost never see it. Grass pink, fairly common orchid in bogs and fens. This has got fake, what are they called, stamens? So, oh, what's the story on this? Sorry, I can't dredge out that right now. Sorry, because I'm trying to get through these for you. Apologize on that. But it does come in a white form.
Oh,
But orchids sometimes fool insects and don't give insects what they expected, but by then the flower's already done its job and rubbed off some pollen onto the insect. I think it's nectar it doesn't give them or something like that. I'm sorry, again, I came through a non-botany winter here, so just getting back in gear. Showy orchis, I always find it always looks out of focus, but it's not. It's sort of the soft edges of it. You know, this point is out of focus, of course, but this internal part is actually in focus. Very tricky that way. But showy orchis are locally common. You find them from here and there. Striped coral root. Now the coral roots, all these are orchids still. They don't have any actual leaves. They have what are called colline leaves, just clasp the stem only. They have no chlorophyll. So again, they live off fungus in the soil. Orchids are very fussy about their habitat, and they must have specific types of fungi in the soil, very specific habitat requirements. And that's why you cannot transplant orchids. They usually do not survive. Early coral root, again, no chlorophyll, even though it looks, maybe it has some because of the color, but coral roots are generally known to not have any chlorophyll. White fringed orchid, there's a bog in Grey County which has literally tens of thousands of these. And it's the only site for many, many, many miles where this even occurs. So why are they there? It's pretty interesting. Calypso orchid, just a few inches tall in the woods, and white sometimes, or colors in between. Much sought after by photographers. Rose begonia, very common in bogs. Showy lady slipper, sometimes along roadsides, just off the edges of roads. Unfortunately, declining due to people digging them up for their gardens. They won't survive more than that season. Pink lady slipper, which grows in a variety of habitats. It's in bogs, but I've also seen it in rocky outcrops, in cracks, in top of a ridge. Very strange. And sometimes you'll come across this variant of pink lady slipper. Somebody sent this to me as a joke when they saw my website. Here, you got to put this on your website. So I did. Yeah. Ram's head lady slipper, much sought after by orchid enthusiasts to see. It's fairly rare, but I have seen clumps of 10, 20 in a swamp in an undisclosed location like that, for example, but 5 times that many, but not a common orchid. People love to find it. There's a group of orchids called rattlesnake plantains. This is downy rattlesnake plantain. There's 4 species of it in Ontario, of the rattlesnake plantains. This is probably the rarest one. And these are the flowers. And this is the only known site in Grey County, this one. Ragged fringed orchid, you got to definitely have to get your feet wet to find this. Definitely. Deep bogs, lots of water around, but pretty fascinating flower. And this is the smallest orchid I've ever found, green adder's mouth. I actually found it in my own bog fen, and I'll show you a little bit about it here. These flowers, some orchids, the flowers start out, as they open and mature, the flower actually rotates 180 degrees. And you can sort of see that you can sort of imagine that happening here. Sort of see one that's not turned as much, and these ones are. And even an idea how tiny this is. So here it is, here, okay. And if we move out, it's right here, okay. And if we move out again, it's right in here. So there's a tripod as scale. So actually a friend of mine, a participant on an FBO outing to our bog actually found this. You got to have what are called orchid eyes to spot that kind of thing. Pretty amazing. A large round-leafed orchid. There you get pretty spectacular flowers. These were about 3 feet high, this whole plant. That was actually in Newfoundland, but this does occur in Ontario. A close-up of that. And spotted coral root, just beautiful, fascinating flowers. White lady slipper. This is only known from, I think, only 2 sites in Ontario now. Both of which shall remain nameless. This is actually in a garden of an orchid enthusiast who spent his work life, his career cultivating orchids. So he was an expert on how to do that. So he has since passed away. Alan Anderson. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He was based out of Guelph. And autumn coral root. This is more common in the south, likes piney, sandy areas. This is actually the furthest northerly location of it, up on the Bruce Peninsula. Notice the poison ivy, which surrounds it, which is all around, which makes this very difficult to photograph up there. This is a population I've been keeping track of for a number of years, just to keep an eye on how many there are. Last fall I checked, and there were almost none. It was greatly reduced. Greatly increased ATV traffic in the area. And there's some, and a closer picture. This is the last orchid species I'm going to show you, and the last species in this presentation. This is Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid, another exceedingly rare species. I know 3 locations for it. I've visited 2 of them. One of them is really far off the road to find. Spectacular white flowers. One of them's down Windsor area, another one's up on the Bruce, and another one's in Grey Bruce elsewhere. There it is. What a beauty. Very, very rare. And this is its habitat. You see it down here in the lower right, but this is where it likes to grow. And this last picture I put in because it tells a story. This is a trusted friend I took with me. We went exploring on this site, and he's known him for a long time. We're good friends. He's a bit of a joker. So we're tromping around in this bog, in this habitat, and I hear him say, "Help, help, I fell in." I look back and it looks like he's sitting on the ground pretending he fell in. I says, "Ah," and I kept on walking. Well, it turns out, I found out later, he really did fall in. He was asking for help. He never let me forget that. I never lived it down. But because I guess that's what you get for being an eternal joker. People don't take you seriously. He managed to extricate himself, and his camera equipment was not damaged, so that's all that really matters to us photographers anyways. So yeah, pay attention if somebody says help, help, and they're in a bog. Conversely, don't joke around about needing help either, okay? Because you can go through, and you could be stuck there for a while. I once went through into a bog in the winter by myself, a mile from the road. Fortunately, it wasn't too cold, and I was wearing snowshoes, fortunately, so I could take them off underwater and put them up on the snow and haul myself up out of the frozen water. And then I decided to hike quickly back to my vehicle rather than making a fire, because it wasn't all that cold, only about, I don't know, 5-10 below zero. So I was okay that time, fortunately. I have a habit of going into the wilds by myself, but that's what I choose to do, and that's what I like. And just a brief advertisement, shall we say, about my websites. I don't really make any money from you visiting, so it's not really an advertisement, but just to remind you that they're there. And thank you for watching. This picture is not Ontario, unfortunately, but this is in the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee, which, if you're getting sick of waiting for spring to come in Ontario, go down here in the third week of April, and there are literally billions of wildflowers blooming. A lot of them are similar or same species as what we have here. So it's a wonderful place to go. But I like using this picture as a backdrop for this, because it's just so lush and exploding with wildflowers. And that's it. Thank you for watching.